She had been sitting in that waiting room since 9:07 in the morning, and by the time the receptionist called her name, it was 11:43 a.m. And the folder on her lap had 47 pages inside it. The air conditioning on the fourth floor of Emerald Gate Trading's Victoria Island building had been running since before she arrived. Her arms were cold. The conference room smelled of new carpet and chilled air. 3 people sat at the long table, a woman whose name tag said HR, Blessing, a man in a gray suit who did not introduce himself, and the CEO, Emmanuel Obiageli. He looked at her dress before he looked at her face. He looked at the folder before he looked at what was inside it. And when she opened the first page and began to explain what she had found in 3 years of the company's publicly available annual reports, pulled from the Corporate Affairs Commission database, and studied across 11 weeks at a dining table after her children slept, Emmanuel Obiageli laughed. Not politely. Not briefly. 4 seconds, with his head tilted slightly to one side. The man in the gray suit looked at the edge of the table. The woman named Blessing stopped writing on her clipboard. She closed the folder, thanked him for his time, and walked out. She did not know yet what she was carrying in that folder. Neither did he. The difference between them was that in 26 months, one of them would come to understand exactly why it mattered. Nkechi Eduke was 41 years old and 113 pounds on the morning of that interview, which was 14 pounds less than she had weighed in the month her husband moved out of their apartment in Lekki Phase 1 and left a note on the kitchen table saying he would send money when he could. He had not sent money. He had sent a message through his brother 4 months later saying he was in Abuja now and that things were complicated. She wore a white dress with a blue adire pattern bought from a trader at Tejuosho Market the previous September for 2,100 naira. The dress was 3 years old. She had pressed it on the bedroom floor at 5:47 that morning with her travel iron, while Emeka was still asleep. It had been washed by hand the night before in the bathroom sink with a bar of key soap. The dress was clean. She had 3 children. Obiora, 14, who did his homework at the kitchen table every evening without being asked, Ifeoma, 11, who had her mother's handwriting, and Emeka, 7, who still slept with a green cloth rabbit he had named Professor. The school fees for all 3 totaled 63,400 naira per term. 2 terms were overdue. The folder had been started 11 weeks earlier at the dining table, after the children went to sleep, with a cup of Lipton tea cooling beside her laptop. She had pulled Emerald Gate's annual reports from the CAS database and begun reading. The thing she noticed first was not dramatic. It was a number. The cost line for logistics and distribution had grown by exactly 22.8% in year 1. 23.1% in year 2, and 23.4% in year 3. Revenue had not grown at all. She wrote the figures into the notebook that had belonged to her mother, a brown-covered composition notebook bought in Enugu in 1993, with her mother's name on the inside cover, Adaobi Eduke. Her mother had spent 23 years as a senior loans officer at First Bank's Enugu branch and had died in 2019. And she had taught Nkechi to read financial statements the way she had taught her to read everything, starting with the patterns, not the words. 14 pages of that notebook filled with calculations before she understood what she was looking at. The 47 pages in the folder were the explanation. The morning of the interview, she packed the folder in her daughter's school canvas tote bag and took 3 buses from Lekki to Victoria Island. 2 hours and 14 minutes. She arrived at the Emerald Gate building at 8:52 a.m., and the receptionist told her to wait. She watched 4 other candidates go in and come back out. 2 of them wore suits with lapel pins. 1 carried a leather portfolio. She straightened her own dress twice. She did not open the folder to review it. She had read it enough times that she had memorized the first 6 pages entire. At 10:31 a.m., the man in the gray suit came out and told her it would be a few more minutes. She said thank you. At 11:43 a.m., they called her name. Emmanuel Obiageli had founded Emerald Gate Trading in 1999 with 400,000 naira and a supplier contact inherited from his uncle. By 2024, the company employed 211 people across 11 states and had a name in the import and export trade that had taken 25 years to build. He was 53 years old. He wore a watch that cost more than Nkechi had earned in the 11 months before the interview. He had not personally reviewed a walk-in application in 6 years. Blessing had forwarded the cover letter because it was, in her words, unusually detailed. Detailed in a way she couldn't categorize cleanly as either impressive or absurd. He had agreed to the meeting as a courtesy. 10 minutes was the understanding between them. She was in the room for 8 minutes when she reached the section on the Northern distribution chain, 8 supplier contracts being renewed automatically, without performance benchmarks, against rate structures that had not been reviewed since 2018. In a market that had moved significantly in that time. She said the company could recover the cost differential through renegotiation of just 2 of those contracts. She said the recovery window, if acted on properly, was within 90 days. He laughed at the 90 days. He said the company was looking for someone to manage accounts payable, not to restructure operations. He said it pleasantly. He was the way a person is when something lands so far outside their frame of expectation that the body produces a sound before the mind has finished deciding what to do. Blessing's pen had not moved in over a minute. The man in the gray suit was looking at his phone. She closed the folder. She said thank you for the opportunity. She stood, picked up the canvas bag, and walked to the door without looking at the table again. In the elevator on the way down, a young woman got on at the 3rd floor, holding a takeaway container of jollof rice. The elevator filled with the smell of it, palm oil and tomatoes, still warm. The young woman's perfume was sweet and a little sharp underneath it. 7 floors, side by side, without speaking. At the ground floor, the young woman walked toward the turnstile without looking back. Nkechi walked to the bus stop on Ozumba Mbadiwe Avenue. The sun was directly overhead. She stood in it for 19 minutes before the bus came. She applied to 11 more companies over the following 6 weeks. 3 automated rejection emails, 2 first interviews that went nowhere, 6 responses of silence. She spent 4,200 naira on transportation for interviews alone. By the 14th of December, her landlord, Misty Effiong, was standing in her doorway with his hands in his pockets, telling her that the 3-month outstanding balance, 255,000 naira, needed to be resolved before January, or he would need the apartment for his nephew. He said it without hostility. He said it the way a person says something they have been rehearsing. She told him she understood. She closed the door. That night, at 10:30, Emeka came out of his bedroom with the green rabbit in one hand. He had heard voices in the hallway. He found his mother at the dining table with the composition notebook open in front of her. He sat down beside her, without asking, and set the rabbit on the table, next to the notebook. He said, "Professor says things are going to be fine, Mummy." He said it with the complete certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to hedge. He had his father's ears and his grandmother's eyes. Nkechi looked at him for a moment. She put her hand on the back of his head. Then she picked up her pen. She found a clean page. She wrote 2 words at the top. Nadi Financial. Below it she wrote, "What I know how to do." And then, In her mother's notebook, she wrote everything she had learned in 14 years of working accounts and financial analysis at 3 different companies that had restructured or dissolved around her while she kept the ledgers straight. She registered the business name on the 3rd of January, paid 27,000 naira borrowed from her sister in Enugu, and printed 50 business cards at a shop in Surulere for 1,300 naira. She emailed 12 people she had worked with over the years. 9 replied. 1 came back 3 weeks later with a name. Her first client was a fabric wholesaler in Balogun Market named Alhaji Dabiri, who needed someone to reconcile 22 months of unsorted bank statements. He paid her 35,000 naira for 2 months of work. It covered the school fees for 1 child and the bus fare to Enugu to see her sister. She sat on that bus for 5 hours and looked out the window at the flat landscape of Edo State and counted, on the back of one of her business cards, what was still outstanding. The rain started somewhere outside Asaba. It hit the roof of the bus like stones thrown from a height, the kind of rain that ran down the windows in thick rivers and turned the road gray and made the headlights of oncoming lorries smear wide across the glass. The man beside her pulled his bag from under the seat and onto his lap without looking up from his phone. She put the business card back in her pocket. She had known since she was 12 years old, sitting in her mother's kitchen in Enugu, watching Adaubi work through the household accounts in that same brown notebook, that numbers told true stories, that they did not deceive you if you asked the right questions. The 22 months of Alhaji Dabiri's bank statements had told her 3 things, which she had laid out on a single page. He read it at his desk while she waited, and when he looked up, he said he had not understood why one of his suppliers had been making him feel like a fool for 2 years, until right now. That summary became the second client. Word moved the way it moved in the markets, from one mouth to the next, folded into the edge of a conversation, carried without ceremony. If this story is already sitting with you the way I think it is, subscribe now, because what happens next is something Emmanuel Obiageli never imagined was coming. By the 9th month, Nadi Financial had 4 clients. Not enough to move out of the apartment in Lekki or clear the full debt with Mr. Effiong, but enough that she had stopped counting coins at 11 o'clock. By the 11th month, she had retained a 5th, a printing company in Ikeja that had been underpaying VAT for 3 years and was now facing an FERS audit. She worked on that file for 6 weeks. She slept less. Obiora started making dinner on the evenings she was still at the table at 7. He was 14, and he cooked rice and stew in a pot that was slightly too small for 3 portions, and always made a little extra. The printing company signed a 12-month retainer on the 4th of November. It was the largest single contract Nadi Financial had held. 3 weeks later, the printing company's parent holding group filed for reorganization under a debt covenant and sent a letter to all subsidiary vendor contracts, placing them on a 90-day review hold. The 12-month retainer was suspended. She read the letter on a Thursday evening, sitting at the table with Emeka's green cloth rabbit on the floor beside her chair where he had dropped it. She read it twice. She set it face down. She picked up the composition notebook and wrote the new numbers. Then she turned to the next clean page and wrote a list of companies she had not yet approached. The third name on the list was Emerald Gate Trading. She had been watching the company from a distance for 2 years by then. The way you watch something you have already thought through carefully and set aside for the right moment. The quarterly numbers were public. The logistics cost line had continued rising, 23.7% in the most recent fiscal year, compounding cleanly on top of what was already there. A government tender had been announced in June, a national school infrastructure supply contract worth 3 billion naira with an application deadline in 8 weeks. She had not been specifically planning to approach them when she ran into Pauline Mensah at Tejuosho Market on a Saturday morning in late November. Pauline Mensah was 67 years old, retired from First Bank after 31 years in corporate finance, and she kept a stall at the market on Saturday mornings because, as she told anyone who asked, she had never trusted a woman who stopped working. She was the one who had noticed Nkechi 3 months earlier, sitting at the outside table of the suya shop beside the market with a yellow highlighter and the brown composition notebook open in front of her, working on the printing company's VAT file. Pauline had sat down without asking, looked at the open page for a long time, and said, "Your cost allocation model here. Where did you learn that?" They had talked for an hour and 20 minutes that first Saturday, and the following Saturday, and the one after that. It was Pauline who mentioned, in the third week of December, that she served on the advisory panel of the audit firm Emerald Gate had contracted for their tender compliance review. She said it the way retired bankers mention industry adjacencies, not casually, but with the ease of someone who had long since stopped keeping score of who knew what. Then she said something else. She said, "Blessing, the HR manager at Emerald Gate, is my neighbor's daughter. She told me at Christmas last year about a woman who came in for an interview and laid a 47-page analysis on the table." She said the CEO laughed. She said she had thought about it ever since. Pauline paused. She looked at the notebook sitting between them on the table. She said the woman had a brown notebook. Old, another person's handwriting on the first page. Nkechi looked at her. Pauline said, "Adobe Aduke worked at First Bank's Enugu branch from 1987. I arrived at that branch in 1990. We worked side by side for 14 years. She lifted her tea. When Blessing described that notebook, I knew exactly whose daughter had walked into that conference room. And I knew exactly what Emmanuel Obiageli had laughed at. Outside the market, a cart of plantains was being wheeled past by a man calling his prices in a voice that carried over everything. 2 women were arguing amicably over the weight of a bag of tomatoes at the adjacent stall. Somewhere behind the stalls, a radio was playing a Fela Kuti record, the bass line low and looping through the Saturday morning air. Nkechi said, "The tender deadline is in 8 weeks. Pauline said, "I know. The board is meeting Tuesday. They're bringing in outside consultants. Their internal team has been working on the supply chain problem for 4 months, and they have run out of time." She looked at Nkechi in the way that older women look at younger women when they have given them every piece of information that is needed and are now waiting quietly to see what is done with it. Nkechi submitted a formal proposal to the Emerald Gate Board Secretary on Monday at 4:17 p.m. by email and courier. The letter was 4 pages. Nadi Financial's credentials, 3 case studies with client permission, and a description, without drama, without complaint, of the specific nature of the problem in the northern supply chain and the approach that would resolve it within the compliance window. She did not mention the November 2022 interview. She attached the executive summary, which carried a date at the top right corner, November 12th. 2022. On Wednesday afternoon, the board secretary called. Was she available to present to the full board on Friday morning at 9 a.m.? She said yes. She was at the Emerald Gate building at 8:31 a.m. on Friday. A different receptionist checked her in. The elevator worked the same way. The 4th floor looked the same corridor, the same framed certificates on the wall. The same cool air. The conference room was the same room, the same long table, the same view of the Lagos Lagoon through the window, the same quality of stillness a room holds in the minutes before people arrive. She was the 4th item on the agenda. At 9:58 a.m., she was called in. 9 people sat at the table, Emmanuel Obiageli was one of them, 4 seats from the head. With a glass of water in front of him and a copy of her executive summary. He looked up when she walked in. Something in his face reorganized itself in the quiet way that faces change when recognition arrives before the person has decided what to do with it. He looked at the folder she was carrying. He looked at her face. Then he looked at the table. She sat down. She set the folder in front of her. She said, "Good morning." She opened the folder. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, and she did not read from the pages. The 47-page analysis from 2022 had been updated and expanded across 14 months of active consulting work, and now ran to 61 pages, and she had committed every number to memory. She named the 3-year compounding cost deviation in the logistics contracts, identified the 8 supplier agreements operating against outdated rate benchmarks, described the 2 contracts that could be renegotiated within the tender's 90-day compliance window, and laid out a monitoring protocol that would prevent the same structural drift from recurring across the following 3 fiscal years. When she was done, she closed the folder. She said, "I'm happy to take questions." 4 seconds of silence. The board chairwoman, Dr. Funmilayo Osei, 64 years old and 37 years in corporate governance, removed her glasses and set them on the table. She said, "How quickly can you begin?" Emmanuel had not spoken during the presentation. He had sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at the pages she had placed in front of each board member. After Dr. Osei spoke, he looked up at Nkechi. He said, "We have met before." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He said, 2022. She said, "November. I was applying for the accounts payable position." A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Someone slid a water glass without picking it up. Emmanuel looked down at the executive summary in front of him. At the date printed in the top right corner, November 12, 2022. He looked at it for a long time. His hands, which had been folded together on the table, separated. When he spoke, it was quietly enough that only the 3 people nearest him could fully hear what he said. Those 3 people would later describe the words slightly differently. What they all agreed on was that it was short, and that it was not a defense. The board retained Nadi Financial Consulting that afternoon on a 6-month contract valued at 8,700,000 naira, structured to deliver compliance documentation for the government tender within 60 days and a full supplier restructuring within 90. The formal signing was held in that same conference room 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning. Pauline Mensah was not present. She was at her stall at Tejosho Market, selling shea butter to a woman who was telling her about a consulting firm a friend had used recently. Exceptional. Absolutely exceptional. The firm was called Nadi Financial. Had she heard of it? Emmanuel was not removed from his position. What shifted around him was harder to name and harder to reverse. At the board's direction, he drafted a formal written acknowledgement to Nkechi, which entered the company's governance record. He recommended Nadi Financial to 2 partner companies in the following quarter. The HR and interview protocol was revised, a 4-page amendment specifying that all unsolicited analysis submitted by candidates in advance of or during interviews must be reviewed by a department head before the meeting takes place. The amendment was entered as Section 4C in the company's HR governance manual. It carried no one's name. It simply existed from that point forward, and it changed how the building received the next person who walked through the door carrying a folder. Emmanuel Obiageli thought, in November 2022, that he was bringing something to a close. He had closed a door on 47 pages of the clearest financial thinking in that building. He had sent home a woman who weighed 113 pounds and wore a 2,100 naira dress and carried her mother's notebook and 3 overdue school fee notices in a canvas tote bag. He thought he was sending her away with nothing. She walked out of that building with everything that was going to matter. There are people who hold what they know the way other people hold documents of ownership, quietly, in both hands, without needing to announce it. You can send them to a bus stop in November with no callback and no explanation. You can sit at the head of a table and make a sound that lasts 4 seconds and contains an entire worldview inside it. You can decide that the folder is the wrong kind of impressive. But you cannot revoke what 14 years of learning builds inside the body. You cannot take from a person what they have spent their life understanding. That understanding goes where the person goes. And sometimes where the person goes is back through the same door, with 61 pages instead of 47, and the date of the original work sitting in plain view on the table between you, where both of you can see it clearly and neither of you needs to explain what it means. Nkechi Eduke runs Nadi Financial Consulting from a 2-room office in Ikeja with 4 staff members and 11 client companies across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. The brown composition notebook with Adaobi Eduke's name on the inside cover sits on the right side of her desk, where the afternoon light reaches it at 2 o'clock on clear days. She still writes in it. The handwriting changes somewhere around page 30, where her mother's entries end and her own begin, but the questions on every page are the same. What does this number actually mean? What is it telling you that the obvious reading conceals? Obiora turned 16 in January. He still makes rice in the pot that is slightly too small. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer. If someone had laughed at your best work on the day you needed it most, and 2 years later they were calling, because that same work was the only thing standing between them and collapse, would you go back? And if you did, could you walk into that room without needing them to say something first? Because Nkechi went back. She did the work. She opened the folder. She let the numbers speak. I want to know if you could do the same. Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read every one. Subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, hidden knowledge, and the people who keep building long after every door has been closed on them. I'll see you in the next one.